For a number of years, I took advantage of the somewhat more relaxed summer season to deliver a summer sermon series, a few sermons that were all about a general theme. And I've chosen to do that again this year, and tonight's the first of a series of 5 or 6 sermons that I'll be delivering over the next few weeks, with the only interruption being next week and one time in August when our congregation will have Shul by the Pool Shabbat experiences. Now, tonight's sermon is really a second installment of a sermon that I'm sure many of you remember quite vividly. I gave it in 1985 or 1986, and it was titled the same as tonight's sermon, New Mitzvot for Our Times. But for the few of you whose memory is not quite as sharp, and especially for those of you who were not there to hear that sermon, either because you didn't live here, or because you weren't even born, or because you had something more important to do that night, let me repeat in a somewhat adapted form some of what I said way back then. Among the most meaningful Jewish prayers and practices are the blessings we recite for many occasions in our ritual lives and in our personal lives. And those prayers all have something in common. They include the words Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, the lighting of Shabbat and festival candles, as we heard it tonight, sung by Mary Lynn, the eating of matzah at a Passover Seder, the eating of bitter herbs at the Passover Seder, listening to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, or the reading of the Megillah on Purim, putting on a talit. These are all preceded by blessings that contain those words, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, blessings for the various life ceremonies, such as a Brit Milah, circumcision, marriage, and on being informed of the death of a relative or a friend. These are blessings that are recited, and there are other blessings too that may not contain those particular words, but they are preceded with Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, O Lord. For instance, the blessing that one would recite traditionally when washing one's hands before a meal, or one that contains those words when we affix a mezuzah to our doorpost, or placing tefillin, the phylacteries on one's head or one's arm. Each of these and so many other practices are preceded by a blessing that acknowledges that what we are doing, that particular act, is a mitzvah. The word mitzvah, generally translated as commandment, acts that we do in part because the Torah commands that we do them. But not all mitzvot, of course, require a blessing. Some are just done. What's very conspicuous is the absence of a blessing. There's no blessing really to be recited when you give tzedakah, because nothing ought to delay the performance of that act, not even the recitation of a blessing. But when we say a blessing before a special act, we are elevating it to a special or different position. It becomes not just an act, but a sacred act or a holy act. And I went on to say then that the aim of all of these benedictions, these blessings, is, I believe, to prevent us from taking things for granted. The recitation of blessings elevates the act from the mundane and raises it up to the holy. To recite a blessing as Jewish tradition calls for when hearing thunder or when drinking wine, is to take note of the special quality of that natural phenomena or that act. And then I said also that for many years, I have favored the translation of those words, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, with this translation: we thank God who has provided us with opportunities for the attainment of holiness, instead of translating it as the usual, who has sanctified us with commandments. And the reason is because I really believe that by the recitation of a blessing to accompany an act, our lives are invested with sanctity. Washing one's hands before a meal and lighting candles, those can be just routine acts, but the recitation of a blessing prior to doing them somehow elevates them to something special. Now, most mitzvot, and I'll leave that word untranslated, most mitzvot for which we are to say a blessing have their origin in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. Circumcision, eating matzah on Passover, putting a mezuzah up on the doorpost. Those are all biblical in origin. But not all mitzvot are biblical. One that you all practice doesn't come from the Bible at all. The blessing, for example, recited when one lights the candles on the Hanukkah menorah. That has no biblical basis at all, because Hanukkah is a post-biblical holiday. If there were no blessings that are post-biblical, then I suppose one could say that, well, there's no justification for adding new ones. But the fact is that additions were made over a long period of time, and that opens the door to developing new blessings for actions that are unique to our age and are very much in the spirit of mitzvot. And to declare those acts being special or holy or sacred might well be to accompany them with a new blessing, a blessing which affirms their status as mitzvot. So in that sermon from the 1980s, I suggested that there are 4 actions that might well constitute new mitzvot for our time. So in abbreviated form, here's what I said. The first one is the act of signing one's name to a document. In many states, it's provided when applying for a new driver's license or having an old one renewed. But the act of signing one's name to a document that says that we are desirous of donating our organs for transplantation. This is a mitzvah for our times. Our ancestors could not have formulated such a blessing because the possibility of organ transplantation is so new. To make one's organs available to lengthen the life of another person is, I believe, a holy act, an act that raises up the giver to a higher level of being human. And that's what a mitzvah is all about. It's in keeping with the spirit of Jewish teaching that tells us that to save one life is like saving the entire world. And then I said that this choice ought to be accompanied by a benediction, recognizing the opportunity that we have of doing something sacred. When signing that organ transplant donor card or having that designation put on our driver's license, we should say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, sovereign of the world, who has given us mitzvot, enabling us to attain holiness, and yet commanded us to share our bodily organs with those for whom they could be of help." The second mitzvah that I called for way back then, is somewhat related to the first. It's the mitzvah to donate blood. The shortage of human blood continues to be critical. Jews should see the donation of blood as a mitzvah. Now, the fact is that not all of us are able to give blood. There are restrictions because of age or physical condition or the use of certain medications that prevent many from being regular donors. But for those who are able, it ought to be something that they do regularly. There's also a certain self-interest involved. In the event that we or members of our family might need blood at some time, it will be available. As a mitzvah, donating blood merits a blessing such as praise be God for commandments enabling us to attain holiness, and specifically for the mitzvah to donate blood. The third act that I called for as a new mitzvah was to sign a living will, a document which expresses our desire that in the event, for some reason, we become unable to make decisions for ourselves, that those who care for us might know that it is not our desire for our lives to be prolonged by heroic measures. That document, unfortunately, in many states is merely advisory, determining what types of medical care or how much treatment should be given in the event of a coma or mental incapacity is, I believe, a very personal individual right. And so the living will or advance directive, and there are many forms of it, enables one to make his or her desires clear to family and friends and physicians. And the development today of techniques to prolong life are wonderful, but they also bring with us, as you know, the possibility of life being prolonged often when there is no quality of life left. The signing of such a document ought to be seen as a religious act, a mitzvah, and it can be and should be recognized by a blessing which has the traditional formula that then ends with the words, "who has enabled us to make choices for ourselves with regard to the quality of life." Choosing to have one's life end, hopefully with dignity, when there's no quality of life left, is a mitzvah. And the fourth act that I advocated ought to be thought of as a mitzvah is the act of voting. It's one of the rewards that we have of living in a democracy. The right that we have to elect our public officials. And yes, with all the criticism that we can level at the electoral process, and all of the criticism we can heap on election campaigns, it is a privilege to vote. And it's a shame that so many, all too many, don't exercise that right. Voting as an American is a mitzvah. The use of the democratic process is a mitzvah. And being a mitzvah, it should be performed perhaps with the recitation of a blessing such as, "Blessed be you, God, sovereign of the universe, who has provided us with opportunities to attain holiness and enabled us to vote." Now, since we recite a blessing when we engage in the study of Torah, we ought to say a blessing when we engage in community responsibility. And if we see voting as a holy act, then perhaps maybe we'll make even wiser choices when we cast our votes. Now, sometime shortly after giving that sermon in the mid-1980s, I had the opportunity to spend some time with one of the most brilliant Jewish women and Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, a woman by the name of Dr. Trudy Weiss Rosmarin. She happened to spend the last years of her life in Santa Monica. She was the editor and publisher of one of the leading Jewish periodicals, The Jewish Spectator. And I don't know what prompted our discussion of new mitzvot, but when I shared my ideas with her, she urged me to turn that sermon into an article in her magazine, and I did that. This is the issue that had it in summer of 1987. And then sometime later, when the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the national organization of Reform rabbis, published this book called On the Doorposts of the House, Prayers and Ceremonies for the Jewish Home, for individual people, they followed my suggestion and included a page of new benedictions for the fulfillment of mitzvot, and they included a prayer to be recited on performing an act to benefit others, such as donating blood or signing an intention to be an organ transplant donor, as well as a prayer on reaching the age of civic responsibility, such as voting or performing a civic duty. And I take a certain amount of pride in having been the creator of these prayers and the acknowledgement that these are new mitzvot. Well, now the time has come to expand that list from the 4 that I called for around 30 years ago, and that's what this summer sermon series is about. Because over the years, and especially more recently, I've thought about other acts that should be regarded as mitzvot, as holy or sacred acts. And I will be sharing 5 or 6 of them over the next few weeks, and I hope that you will be there to hear those sermons. There are indeed acts that are so important, that are so valuable and significant, that they should be regarded by us as mitzvot. And whether or not they're accompanied by the recitation of an actual blessing or not is really not that important, though I think it's helpful. What is important is the attitude that we bring to those acts. And the times we live in present us with numerous challenges and opportunities, and when we approach them seriously and see them as sacred or holy acts, they become for us mitzvot. Even more important, I think, than many of the mitzvot that traditionally make up our Jewish way of life.